For more on the outlook for the economy, let's bring in David Stockman, former budget director under President Reagan. He's also the author of The Great Deformation, The Corruption of Capitalism in America. Mr. Stockman, welcome to Bottom Line. Good to have you on.
Glad to be here.
Last night, the president called for increased federal spending. That immediately was getting shot down by the Republicans in Congress. That money would be used for infrastructure improvements to fix the nation's roads and bridges. The president also called for the first increase in the minimum wage in 6 years. Aside from being a hostile political environment, in some circles, it's being called a hostile economic environment. Things are still sluggish. Are any of these things achievable in this environment?
No, they're not achievable, and they shouldn't be achievable. The last thing we need to do is raise the minimum wage. Our economy is struggling to create jobs. We've created 4 million from the bottom at the end of the recession, but we're still 3 million jobs in the hole. Half of those jobs have been part-time, quasi-minimum wage or just above the minimum wage. It's the only thing we can seem to generate. And why he thinks going in and telling employers that you're going to have to pay 30% more, 25% more makes any sense, I don't know. It shows you that Washington is not focused on the problem. The problem is their budget.
Okay, let me ask you then, if the minimum wage is increased from its current level of $7.25 to $9, would employees be more likely to spend that, and would that not help the economy because that's an increase in consumer spending?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's just, the same old Keynesian medicine. If that were the case, let's raise the minimum wage to $16 an hour, $20 an hour. People would have plenty to spend, but you can't tamper with the market. There's supply and demand. Employers on the margin are going to automate, or they're going to, ask the consumer to do the work and not hire a clerk. You can't get yourself in the middle of a $15 trillion economy and try to do good. You're only going to do unanticipated harm. This makes no sense.
So at this point, then, it would be incumbent upon private employers to push up the wages of their employees and not have it mandated by Congress?
Yeah, I don't think it should be mandated by Congress. I think the supply and demand in the market would generate jobs. I think the minimum wage is too high. It ought to actually be reduced. If people need more income, then we should provide transfer payments through food stamps or through a cash transfer mechanism or through the earned income tax credit to supplement what they're earning in the market. But we can't go in and tell this marketplace, in the competitive world that we're in today, that we're going to arbitrarily dictate what the economic wage is going to be. It doesn't work.
Sir, the president continues to insist that Congress pay down this deficit. He says there should be what he called a fair and balanced mix, combination of spending cuts and tax increases. When you told President Reagan he had to raise taxes, he was hesitant at first. He didn't want to do it, but you said we're basically draining the Treasury with the tax cuts that have been implemented, so the president did go along. What would you tell congressional Republicans today?
I would tell them the same thing. They need to fight for spending cuts, which they haven't. They need to tell the truth to the public that Social Security is out of control, and the better off affluent retirees need to have their benefits cut through a means test. They need to go after the Pentagon. It's $150 billion too big. They ought to be as tough on the Pentagon as they are allegedly on domestic spending. And then after they do all that, they should be prepared to put new revenue on the table, because we need that too. Now, they ought to be fighting for a consumption tax to supplement what we're getting from income. But by taking this kind of know-nothing posture, no taxes ever, anyway, anyhow, anytime, they're simply making themselves irrelevant and not engaging in the debate we need, because we have a deficit facing this country of 15 or 20 trillion over the next 10 years. Not what they think in Washington. It's far bigger because the economy is far weaker.
Mr. Stockman, yesterday I spoke to Stuart Eisenstadt. He was the Deputy Treasury Secretary during the Clinton administration, and I asked him about the two schools of thought regarding sequestration. The one school of thought is, let it happen. It's about time. We've got to get our spending under control. We've got to get this debt under control. The other school of thought is we can't possibly let this happen because it would cripple a nascent economic recovery. He was in the latter camp. Which camp are you in?
I'm in the let it happen camp. It's not an ideal way to make policy, but our system is so paralyzed, it's so dysfunctional that it may be the only way we can get at this massive waste that we have in the Pentagon.
But you do do know that there are military leaders, outgoing Defense Secretary Panetta, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of them say that this would have a crushing effect on our military preparedness and readiness.
Well, I don't believe a word Panetta has to say. He's been in Washington 40 years. He's part of the problem. He's so used to this massive government and massive deficits, and let's not worry about it and lay it on our children, that he can't even think straight. I don't believe that whatever he has to say is relevant at all.
Mr. Stockman, we have about a minute left. And when I knew we were going to get you on, I had to ask you, why does President Obama continue to preside over a sluggish economy? Is it his policies? Does he not want to pivot? Is he a stubborn man? Or is this a question of the economic and political headwinds have just buffeted this economy to the point where it doesn't matter who is in the Oval Office, we were still going to have this growth that was just trudging along?
The latter. This is not something that he caused. He's made it a bit worse, but it's a 30-year buildup of headwinds. We borrowed our way to prosperity, the household sector, the business sector, the government. We now have $54 trillion of debt, public and private, on the U.S. economy, way more as a relative to GDP or income than we ever had historically. And it's that debt burden which is holding down the recovery. And frankly, we're going to be fighting this debt problem, public and private, for a decade ahead. And we're going to have constant headwinds, and we're going to be in a constant fiscal crisis because we have no consensus on how to address it.
Sir, may I ask you quickly in 10 seconds? You mentioned briefly entitlement reform. How crushing a burden is this, and how much of entitlement reform is going to have to be on the table?
A lot. The Medicare and Social Security, the two big non-means-tested entitlements, cost $1.5 trillion. We should cut them by $200 billion by means testing the affluent retirees.